Back at the mall, Oscar was a wreck. The police had arrived, but they were limited in what they could do at that moment. They took down all the information Oscar could provide, descriptions of his friends, Genevieve, the car they were driving, and the route they were supposed to take. The officers assured him that they would do everything they could to locate them, but their calm professionalism did little to ease Oscar's growing panic. He couldn't just stand around and wait, every fiber of his being was screaming at him to take action. But what could he do? Where could he even begin to look? His mind was racing, filled with images of Genevieve in danger, and the helplessness was unbearable. Oscar's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ringing of his phone. His heart skipped a beat as his eyes landed on the screen, seeing Genevieve's name flashing before him. A wave of fear washed over him, sending a shiver down his spine. With trembling hands and a sense of dread creeping up his throat, he answered the call, silently hoping that everything was okay. He braced himself for the worst but desperately wished for good news. However, the moment he heard the voice on the other end, his blood turned cold. It wasn't Genevieve. "If you want to see Genevieve and your friends alive again, you'll do exactly as we say," a menacing voice growled through the speaker, each word heavy with threat. Oscar's breath hitched, and panic surged through him as he realized the seriousness of the situation. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, his mind reeling as he tried to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't just a minor setback or a delay in their plans, this was life-threatening danger. Fear clawed at him as he realized that the safety of Genevieve and his friends rested entirely in his hands. He was the only one who could save them, but the weight of that responsibility felt overwhelming. The kidnappers made their demands crystal clear. Oscar was not to involve the police under any circumstances. If he did, he risked losing Genevieve and his friends forever. The gravity of their threat weighed heavily on him, leaving no room for error. Oscar's mind raced as he thought of every possible solution. His desperation to save them pushed him to try and negotiate. He was willing to offer anything, absolutely anything they wanted. If it was money they were after, he could give them as much as they needed. However, to his growing confusion, money wasn't what they were interested in. It wasn't about wealth or a quick ransom. What they truly wanted was him. It took Oscar a moment to grasp the full extent of their intentions. They had used Genevieve and his friends as bait to pull him into their trap, and now it was clear that he was the one they were after. The realization sent a wave of fear crashing over him, but despite knowing the dangers ahead, Oscar made the difficult decision to agree to their terms. He couldn't risk their lives, not when they depended on him. Even though he knew the meeting would be perilous, possibly even a death trap, the thought of losing them was unbearable. As the moment to face the kidnappers drew closer, a deep sense of dread clung to him like a shadow. The risk was undeniable. Oscar was stepping into a situation where the stakes were incredibly high, and there was no guarantee of survival for any of them. Still, he knew he couldn't back out now. When Oscar arrived at the secret location, the silence was unsettling. The place was eerily quiet, with not a single person in sight. Every sound, every movement in the shadows, put him on edge. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, his instincts screaming that something wasn't right. He took a few cautious steps forward, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of life, but there was nothing. The stillness only deepened his fear. Just as he was beginning to feel the weight of the tension, it happened. Before he could even register what was going on, a rough, thick cloth was suddenly thrown over his face. The material was coarse and suffocating, pressing against his mouth and nose, cutting off his ability to breathe freely. Panic surged through him, and he tried to struggle, but strong hands gripped him tightly. His mind raced, screaming for him to fight back, but the overwhelming force was too much. He felt himself being shoved roughly, his body stumbling as he was forced into a waiting van. The door slammed shut behind him with a heavy thud, sealing his fate. The van sped off, and Oscar could feel the motion as they drove him far away from any hope of rescue. After what felt like an eternity, the van finally came to a stop, and he was dragged out into the dim light of an old, abandoned warehouse. As he was pushed inside, his eyes quickly scanned the room, and his heart sank when he saw Genevieve and his 3 friends. They were huddled together, bound and helpless, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. The kidnappers had promised to release them once they had Oscar, but it didn't take long for him to realize it had all been a cruel deception. There was no plan to let anyone go. Inside the warehouse, Oscar saw the terrified faces of Genevieve, Tundi, Femi. Mark. Relief flooded him for a moment, but it quickly turned to horror as the kidnappers began torturing his friends in front of him. Their screams echoed in the cold, empty warehouse, and Oscar's helplessness gnawed at him. He tried to plead with the kidnappers, offering them anything they wanted, but their leader remained unmoved. After what seemed like an eternity of torment and despair, one of the kidnappers suddenly dragged Mark out from the shadows. Oscar's heart sank as he saw Mark, their friend, being pulled into the warehouse. The sight was bewildering, leaving Oscar and the others in a state of stunned disbelief. When the kidnapper finally released Mark from his grip, Mark stepped into the dim light with a dark, twisted grin spread across his face. The grin was unsettling, a stark contrast to the fear and pain that had filled the warehouse moments before. Oscar could hardly believe his eyes, his mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. It felt like a nightmarish scene from a movie, but the chilling reality was all too clear. Mark's revelation was even more shocking. As he emerged from the shadows, he began to speak, his voice cold and filled with a bitter edge. He confessed to being the mastermind behind the entire kidnapping plot, his words dripping with malice. The truth was a cruel twist that left everyone reeling. Oscar's mind raced, grappling with the betrayal and the horrifying realization that one of their own had orchestrated their suffering. The revelation was a blow to their hope, replacing it with a deep, crushing disbelief. Mark's relationship with Genevieve had once been quite close. Before Oscar came into the picture, Mark and Genevieve had shared a meaningful connection. They had spent time together, and Mark had been making steady progress in winning her affection. Everything seemed to be going well until Mark's life took a significant turn for the worse. He fell into the wrong crowd and got involved with bad influences that led him down a dangerous path. His life spiraled out of control, and he ended up in prison. It was a harsh wake-up call, one that Mark struggled to navigate. Oscar, who had the resources to help, chose not to intervene immediately. He left Mark behind bars for weeks, believing that enduring time in prison would serve as a lesson for him to change his ways. During the time Mark spent in prison, Oscar's life continued to move forward. He began dating Genevieve, starting a relationship that blossomed into something serious. Unbeknownst to Oscar, while he was building his life with Genevieve, Mark had been harboring deep, unspoken feelings for her. When Mark was finally released from prison, he found himself facing a reality where Genevieve was no longer available, now in a relationship with Oscar. The bitterness and resentment that brewed during his time behind bars had only grown, leading to the shocking betrayal that unfolded. Mark had held on to that bitterness, and when he discovered that Oscar was planning to propose to Genevieve, it pushed him over the edge. He swore to never let him have peace, and now, his twisted plan was unfolding. Oscar tried reasoning with Mark, reminding him of their friendship, but it was too late. Mark was no longer the man they had once known. He had become consumed by jealousy and hatred, his mind twisted beyond recognition. He told Oscar that no one would be leaving the warehouse alive, not after seeing his face. Genevieve, with tears streaming down her face, begged Mark to stop, but his response was a vicious slap that knocked her unconscious. Oscar cried out in rage, trying to lunge at Mark, but he was held back by the kidnappers. Tundi and Femi, equally horrified, tried to appeal to their old friend, but Mark wasn't interested in reconciliation. Mark ordered his men to beat Tundi and Femi, and they were mercilessly attacked. Meanwhile, Mark's plans for Genevieve became even darker. He intended to take her away, far from where anyone would recognize them, and force her to be with him. After a few more hours of torture and intimidation, Mark decided it was time to leave. He dragged Genevieve with him, leaving his men behind with orders to kill Oscar, Tundi, and Femi. Oscar watched helplessly as they drove off, his mind racing with desperation and fear. As the tension in the warehouse reached a breaking point, one of the kidnappers suddenly aimed a gun at Tundi. With a grim, deliberate expression, he fired, hitting Tundi in the hand. The shot was meant as a harsh warning, a chilling reminder of the danger they were all in. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the cold, empty space, amplifying the fear and despair that filled the room. Oscar's heart raced as he saw the scene unfold, his mind struggling to keep up with the rapid escalation. Just when it seemed that the situation could not get any worse, the kidnapper who had been holding the gun on Tundi turned his attention to Oscar. Oscar braced himself, expecting the worst, as the kidnapper prepared to pull the trigger. But in that moment of impending doom, something unexpected happened. A burst of gunfire erupted from outside the warehouse, the rapid succession of shots cutting through the tense atmosphere. The sound of bullets hitting their targets was followed by the chaotic shouts and commotion of armed police officers storming into the warehouse. One by one, the kidnappers fell, overwhelmed by the sudden, fierce attack. Oscar watched in stunned disbelief as the police swiftly took control of the situation. The once menacing kidnappers were now subdued, and the officers began securing the area. Amid the chaos, Oscar finally understood what had transpired. Earlier, before he had come to the secret location, he had taken a precautionary measure. Discreetly, he had sent the coordinates of the warehouse to the divisional police officer, DPO, including a note instructing them to wait a few hours before intervening if they didn't hear from him. This careful planning and foresight had been crucial. It was this very decision that had led to the timely rescue, saving their lives. From the brink of disaster. Now free, Tundi was rushed to the hospital, but Genevieve was still out there with Mark. Oscar, shaken but determined, joined the police in their pursuit. Mark might have gotten away for now, but they weren't going to let him escape. As the police took control of the situation, they quickly began coordinating with various departments to manage the crisis. Roadblocks were strategically set up across multiple routes to prevent any escape and to track down the kidnappers. The search was intense, and every minute counted. The tension in the air was palpable as officers worked tirelessly, hoping for a breakthrough. Finally, as the early hours of the morning arrived, the hard work paid off. A vigilant officer at a checkpoint noticed a car matching the description they had been given. It was a crucial lead, and the police acted swiftly. They stopped the vehicle and, after a brief confrontation, arrested Mark, who was found inside. The arrest marked the end of a harrowing ordeal. Genevieve, who had been held captive and subjected to unimaginable fear, was safely rescued. Although she was safe, the trauma of the experience left her visibly shaken. Her relief was evident, but it was clear that the events had deeply affected her. Standing together on the roadside amidst the commotion of flashing police lights and the blaring sirens, Oscar and Genevieve were physically and emotionally exhausted. The chaotic scene around them seemed to blur into the background as Oscar made a decisive move. With all the uncertainty and fear behind them, he dropped to one knee right there on the pavement. In the midst of the chaos, surrounded by the remnants of their ordeal, Oscar proposed to Genevieve. It was a poignant moment, a symbol of their enduring love and commitment despite everything they had been through. Genevieve, still processing the whirlwind of emotions, looked at him with a mixture of surprise and deep affection. In that moment, amidst the flashing lights and sirens, she said yes. It was a rare and precious moment of joy in the aftermath of their crisis. For the first time in what felt like forever, both of them shared a genuine smile, a sign of hope and a new beginning. Together, they walked away from the nightmare, ready to face their future.